Herzlich willkommen zum zweiten Tag der Media Convention, eine Veranstaltung von Medienboard im Rahmen der Web Week und in Kooperation mit der Republika. Gestern wurde ja schon hier anständig diskutiert und wohl am Ende auch ein bisschen gefeiert. Deshalb kommen jetzt hier noch die letzten erstmal rein. Wir haben aber auch heute wieder ein pickevolles Programm auf der Bühne 11, genauso wie auf der Bühne 12, insgesamt 13 Veranstaltungen, alles zum Thema Media Rules. Wir sprechen über die Zukunft der Nachrichten, wir sprechen über die Zukunft des Fernsehens, haben echte junge Leute hier, die sagen, was sie vom Fernsehen haben wollen. Wir sprechen mit einem Futuristen, der uns erklärt, ob wir als Journalisten vielleicht irgendwann total überflüssig sind. Das alles heute hier auf beiden Veranstaltungen. Mein Name ist Julie Kurz, ich bin Journalistin, arbeite normalerweise beim NDR, habe jahrelang als Autorin beim Medienmagazin ZAP gearbeitet und im Moment als Reporterin für die Tagesschau und Tagesthemen und freue mich heute hier durchs Programm zu führen. Jetzt geht es gleich los mit unserer ersten Veranstaltung, die heißt Out of the Dark. Und da geht es darum, worum wir Journalisten uns ja im letzten Jahr besonders viel beschäftigt haben mit den NSA-Enthüllungen. Manche mehr, manche weniger. Die sich mehr darum gekümmert haben, ist zum Beispiel Appelbaum, der jetzt hier gleich auf die Bühne kommt. Er ist einer der Enthüller gewesen, die herausgefunden haben, dass das Merkel-Handy überwacht worden ist über einen längeren Zeitraum. Außerdem ist er ein enger Vertrauter von Edward Snowden. Mit ihm diskutiert gemeinsam Ole Reißmann. Ole Reißmann ist Redakteur bei Spiegel Online, dort für die Netzwelt zuständig. Und er sagt, Journalisten sollen Haltung haben. Wie sie genau die letzten Monate, letzten Jahre, das letzte Jahr erlebt haben, das erzählen Sie am besten selber. Hier sind sie, Ole Reißmann und Appelbaum.
Good morning. Hi. I'm glad so many people showed up to our early morning session. It's a bit awkward because we both work for the same company. We both work for the Spiegel. And it's a little bit awkward because we cover the same topic and we wear glasses. So maybe we should focus some more on the differences because he's a US citizen and I'm not. So I'm fair game for NSA spy activities. And I don't know, are you too?
Well, I guess it depends. In the last few years, especially with my work with WikiLeaks and Der Spiegel and other news organizations, what we found is that there isn't a big distinction between being a US citizen if you're engaged in society and not being a US citizen, although the public line that the US government takes is very different for me than it is for you. In my case, they try to assure everyone that it's legitimate, and in your case, they don't even try.
But then again, there's a case right now in the US. There's a reporter with the New York Times, and he's facing serious allegations for leaking government secrets.
Yeah, so this is the case about James Reißmann, and without going into too much detail about it, James Reißmann is a pretty amazing American journalist who works with the New York Times. And well, I think that some of the stuff that he writes about is not as interesting. He has written some things where the US government would love for him to testify against his sources. And he's, of course, willing to go to jail for his sources. And he's even taken his court case all the way to the Supreme Court. And just in the last month, the Obama administration has essentially asked the Supreme Court not to hear this case. In other words, to not try to settle the issue about whether or not a journalist has the ability to protect their source. Now, in his case, it's very interesting because he clearly, as a journalist working for the New York Times, is someone who would be targeted by some of these surveillance programs that have been revealed by the courage of Edward Snowden's whistleblowing. However, to actually do something with that information, in this case, they need to get him, James Reißmann, on record saying something. And so this is a big difference where they can't just introduce information in secret. That's a process called parallel construction. And they can't use parallel construction in this case because the case is too high profile. So they need to force him. But there's a very good chance that they actually already know everything that they would need. It's just that they can't introduce it because of the rules. So his case is a really interesting one for that reason, among others.
Why isn't this front page news any other day in the US? Because it's my maybe naive belief that if such things were happening in Germany, there would be an outcry.
Well, I think, at least in the case of Reißmann's case, I think people are upset about it, and I think it is going through a process, especially with the Supreme Court. And I think as it reaches its sort of peak, for example, if the Supreme Court decides in his favor, that will be front page news, and if they decide against him, that will also be front page news.
Hopefully.
One would hope. Although it's not totally clear to me how this will play out. I think a big part of it is that when the Obama administration says how they feel about a thing, a lot of people really tend to fall in line. And journalists in the United States, with very few exceptions, have bad financial models, which create incentives for them to be extremely subservient to people in positions of power. And I think that you see that. You don't want to support the guy that's challenging the president. That could be dangerous for your career. That could be dangerous for your newspaper. Maybe sources will no longer speak to you in the government for political reasons or for fear of reprisal. In fact, that's exactly what Reißmann's case is about. It's about a person who is inside of the government, understands how the government works, speaks to a journalist, and look what has occurred after that. So I think that creates and reinforces a culture of fear, which is reflected in the reporting, which you don't actually see very often about his case.
Now that you're doing your work out of Germany, do you see the same kind of fear in Europe or in Germany?
Sometimes. It's extremely rare, though. So, for example, in working with Der Spiegel, in the last 4 or 5 years, basically 4 years, I've seen, for example, Marcel Rosenbach and Holger Stark, very good journalists at Der Spiegel. I first met them in working with WikiLeaks in 2010. And now when you're talking about things like Cablegate or the war logs or the diaries, these are like data journalism events that are very historic. And these guys were not fearless. They were meticulous. They went through the legal department. They went through the editorial department. And they were very honorable. For example, The Guardian wanted to publish early. And they wanted to publish early and to cut WikiLeaks out. And it was Spiegel. It was actually Marcel and Holger that stopped that from happening. And later, Guardian rewrote history. So if we count the United Kingdom as Europe, then I think The Guardian acts like a bunch of weasels. And I'm very disappointed in the way that they act from time to time, especially with regard to the people that wrote the WikiLeaks book, where they basically claim that they were honorable and a deal is a deal. And that was David Lee. And he framed it as if he stopped Spiegel and the New York Times from going early, and it was The Guardian that was actually trying to honor the deal. It was exactly the opposite of that. And it was him in particular, as I understand it, that wanted to change it. So if we count the UK, I would say that Europe also has cowardly, subservient bastards in journalism. But if we don't count the UK, I would say it's a little different. And I think Germany in particular, there is an effective check on certain kinds of power. And I was surprised by that. And especially with regard to foreign news. The editors and the other journalists working in even at competitors like Zeit or Zeit Online, they're not as worried about what Obama's administration thinks. They're really interested in what is in the public interest, and they think of the public beyond one nation, which to me is, as an American coming and living in Europe, I especially am struck by this. There's 2 worlds for Americans. There's America, and then there's over there Stan or everywhere else. And usually people are only concerned about what the Obama administration or the FBI or people that are in positions of power, what they think, and a lot of their editorial decisions reflect close relationships with those power structures.
But don't you think these things are changing right now? Because The Guardian has opened up an office in New York, or it's expanding their presence in the US. And when the UK government threatened The Guardian, they said, okay, well, we move our reporting to the US.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have any kind words for The Guardian, to be honest. I had a very bad experience with them in the beginning because of the beginning of the Snowden saga, because I was actually helping Glenn Greenwald. And we discussed maybe getting a letter that formalized my relationship. And The Guardian basically said, and I guess it's not public, but let's make it public anyway. Essentially they said, well, we don't want to give you a letter that would show that you're working with us because it would dilute the legal authority of these letters, and we don't want to give out too many of them. And the next day they gave one to Bruce Schneier. So sort of what they told me, if I could be frank about it, was they said, you can go fuck yourself, and you, well, we'll work with you. And in doing so, what they showed me was the quality of their character, and I was really disappointed in that. And I called Russ Bridger out about it, and I felt very upset. And what I found was that if you look at the productions that have happened after that, you see very clear patterns where the Washington Post and the Guardian publish almost exactly the same documents that are redacted in exactly the same way. It doesn't matter that they opened up in the US because the NSA, the GCHQ, the FBI, the Department of Justice, each of these different power structures, they relate their information and how they want information to be presented and to control it. And they've done exactly that. And it's good that the GCHQ wasn't able to stop the publications entirely. But let's make no mistake about it. There is pressure from the White House and from the British government, and The Guardian doesn't publish without really strongly considering that. They're not WikiLeaks. They're not Der Spiegel. They're not journalistic houses that are completely independent of that as their primary consideration. And I really feel that that is. And when you see identical redactions between The Guardian and the Washington Post, it tells you something about a commonality between places that are otherwise competing.
Okay, well, don't you think people are getting tired of all these reportings?
Absolutely. I think the people are exhausted by it.
And now the next thing that's happening, Glenn Greenwald's book is coming up.
Yep.
What difference will that make?
Well, I'm not sure that the books or the reporting themselves make the difference. I think the thing that makes the difference is being able to have an effective political lever to make a change. It's not clear to me that any political party, whether it's the Pirates or the CDU, or the Greens or the SPD, it's not clear to me, for example, that anyone has solutions for mass surveillance. And it's not clear to me which parties are against mass surveillance or surveillance in general. And in fact, in some cases, what you see is that each party inside has different feelings. So, what do people do? People get exhausted, they get tired by it. There's a sort of, I would say, a kind of like sadness about it, because what is to be done? Every day you receive bad news.
But the thing is, we at Spiegel Online, we do see people care about this stuff. Mm-hmm. Even after nearly a year of reporting, when we put up an NSA story, people do read this stuff. And it's puzzling, because there are very high expectations, but the government's doing basically nothing. Der Spiegel has called for asylum on the cover of Der Spiegel last year. And as you said, what is to be done? We still don't know. Maybe, don't you think the expectations are very high? Because last week I met Jane Hall Lute, who was under the Obama administration for 4 years co-head of Homeland Security. And it was my impression that the Obama administration is never going to apologize for anything that has been done in that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think people care, but there's a difference between being exhausted and caring. And there's a difference between wanting to know more and knowing what to do next. And I think this is hard. I mean, I think there's things, for example, in the cypherpunk movement, for a long time, many people have said, well, we need strong cryptography, we need anonymity, we need to be able to protect sources. This is sort of the birth of WikiLeaks with document leaking that's technologically advanced and understands the social, political constructs of journalism. That is a really hard thing to do in this case, I think, to contextualize all that stuff together and to know what to do next, and to think that it's a solution. And I think one key problem here is that what Snowden has revealed is something about trust and a complete undermining of trust. And so this causes people to have a realignment about who they trust, what they trust, how they evaluate the trust. And that is a very, that's a stressful thing. And I think, so we'll see a sort of, day-to-day people do want to learn more, but there's also, it's exhausting. There's a fatigue that sets in when every day you learn a new electronic device in your life is used to spy on you. Every day, something where you previously felt like you were free, you no longer feel that way. And it's actually really difficult for people. I talk with people on a daily basis about it, and there are different reactions, and some of those reactions are actually coping mechanisms. So like people will say, oh, I have nothing to hide. And this is like a doctor who has a requirement for confidentiality in his medical records. I have nothing to hide. Well, why is the doctor saying that? The doctor is saying that because he has no idea what to do. So it's important to sort of recognize that some of the things that are coming out are actually reactions to a feeling of helplessness about it.
To be totally honest, most journalists in Germany don't know how to encrypt anything. So now, since last June, they're trying to catch up with technology, trying to encrypt things, and they realize, oh, well, this is hard.
Yeah, I don't think it's hard. It's really easy, actually. It's not so different than anything else anyone has learned. If you...
Yeah, but isn't it a false sense of security? If there is a reporter putting PGP on his computer, then it's like, oh, well, now I can encrypt things. And then he leaves his laptop unencrypted at an airport. And then the whole trust thing is, I don't know.
Yeah,
this doesn't work.
Absolutely. It's not a single product. But I think an interesting point is that if you look at a J school, for example, there are a lot of things that you take to heart, that you learn. There's a process, and part of that needs to be about how to safely handle information. And there, in fact, generally is the case that if you deal with, say, national security-related issues, people talk about source protection, but it's almost all of the training is analog training. People might think about some of the sort of tradecraft of protecting sources, but it's hard to apply that to a digital world.
Yep.
But I don't think it's difficult. I think it's like any learned skill, which is that if you focus on it and you scope it well and you understand what you're trying to accomplish, you may succeed and sometimes you will fail. But it is certain that there are some journalists who don't even try. So my rule of thumb is that journalists that can't do that, I don't work with them because they're incompetent for the field that I work in, which is about national security-related high-level stuff where there is a necessity for source protection. And that's okay, because I'm also really bad at real estate reporting, for example. I know nothing about that field, and I'm not qualified to work in it. And so I think it's fine, and it's not actually a bad thing. But I think it's a terrible thing if people say that they shouldn't try because they won't succeed. It's not a realistic assessment. If you work in drone research and you're working in the field in Pakistan, you need to know about operational security things as a matter not only of source protection, but of staying alive. If you're a combat correspondent, it's the same. And in the information age, where there's an information conflict taking place, where intelligence agencies are tapping everybody on the planet that they can get their hands on and breaking into their computers, you're in a conflict zone as well, and you have to know how to navigate that conflict zone.
So now more on the differences between the US and Germany. While there are not so many journalists and newspapers in the US willing to do these kind of reportings, in Germany maybe there are more newspapers, magazines interested in these stories and in security matters. But then again, it was revealed that the NSA in the US is collecting metadata. Bulk metadata, communications, who called whom and when and where. And in Europe, we had legislation that makes that totally legal. So it had been turned over at the European level, but in Germany there's talked about data retention laws since 2 weeks ago. How do you can explain these differences? On the one hand, the US people kind of think the government is doing okay. And then again, in Germany, people say, oh no, we don't find that okay. Surveillance is, maybe we should take a look at that. But politics is a whole different story.
Well, I think, at least in terms of data retention in Europe, it's interesting because you see, for example, in Sweden with the FRA law, you see that they're pushing through democratic processes mass surveillance legislation. And in the case of Sweden, they had succeeded. And in the case of data retention in Germany, you see something essentially similar. And people are not necessarily okay with it. But there's a political discussion about it. There are some people that are okay with it. Some people, I think, falsely suggest that it's extremely helpful for crime without recognizing that it actually attracts a different kind of crime. So it's not a zero-sum game. And in the US, one of the striking things here is that it's just happened in secrecy. So you guys had a big debate about data retention. And in the US, it turns out the NSA just implemented it with the FBI and the CIA for 15 years. And since those 15 years have not yet passed, we don't know how long it will actually last. Though it's rumored or they claim to have destroyed some data, it's not clear what it matters if the NSA destroys data if the FBI and the CIA also have a copy. You know, it's a kind of, you add it all together and you get everything again. And so I think, you know, there are a lot of Americans that were shocked to find out that the data retention discussion had happened behind closed doors and that it was settled. And
so it would be much more smart for the US government to just tell the people, well, this is what we're going to do, like they did in Europe, and they just did.
Yeah, I think that the result is that some of these things will be pushed back in the United States in a very fierce way in words. But since it all happened in secret anyway, it'll be very difficult to verify that it's happened. And here I think the process will be that, for example, I think it was the court in Luxembourg that ruled that it was fundamentally incompatible with the rule of law. That means that potentially all of this will happen in the open, and it will be a slow process, but it will change. And I think it'll change openly and in a verifiable way. And I think it's without a doubt a much better situation here. Though it's strange that with such strong outcries, the democratic system still allowed it to happen in the first place, which I think is I don't fully understand how that came to pass.
And you wouldn't think that the same thing would have happened in the US. If the discussion had been open in the US from the beginning, maybe people would have cared about it and pushed back in the first place.
Yeah, I think so, but it's not completely clear to me because some of these arguments are really loaded. You know, like the 4 horsemen of the infopocalypse. Anytime anybody wants to talk about privacy, someone brings up terrorism, money laundering, child pornography, the war on drugs, and they say this is the solution. And so I think that's something that we have to consider as there's a difference of dialogue. I think there's a more adult conversation here, which is less emotionally driven in the politics in Europe, and it shows. And I think that journalists in general in Germany, for example, really tried to contribute to that in a positive and constructive manner. And they do often confront positions of power directly and just ask hard questions.
That's our job.
Yeah, well, but
what else would we do?
But I don't think that we see that as often in the United States. Like the New York Times, for example, when they found out about the warrantless wiretapping program, Bill Keller at the New York Times sat on it over an election. I mean, what is that? I mean, people talk about Glenn Greenwald and they say he's an activist. What is an editorial decision like that during an election year? I mean, that's a political endorsement of the Bush administration, which I think is part of the reason he was reelected. So it's an interesting sort of subpoint, which is that journalists in Germany, in my experience, recognize that there is a political quality to all things that they write. And what they try to do is to be in service of the public interest and to try to challenge power in a way to hold it to account. And in the US, what you see is a lot of subservience to this power. And it's captured very well in the documentary film Media Stand. This is a documentary film made by WikiLeaks, which they actually interview different editors all over the world while traveling around with the diplomatic cables as WikiLeaks partners to open up partnerships. And when they get to the United Kingdom and they get to the United States, they actually interview Rusbridger and Keller about this. And the difference between these two and journalists in Afghanistan or Uzbekistan is startling in terms of what they are most interested in. And obviously, it's worth seeing the film. You can find it on the Pirate Bay. I highly recommend downloading it. It's a really good movie. The author of the film is very happy if you do that, I think.
So don't click on any other links on Pirate Bay because Deutsche Telekom is giving out your IP addresses.
Yeah.
Don't do that. Yeah, well, If there are any questions from the audience, we'll be more than happy to take your input and join our discussion here. Just raise your hand, and I guess we have some people with mics, and we will be happy to let you join us. And meanwhile, we could talk some more about, I don't know.
I think we were discussing a little bit earlier about, before we were on stage, about some of the security precautions, and
the journalists could take.
The journalists could take, exactly.
And which journalists do you talk about? Is this high-level national security stuff, or any other journalist?
Well, I think any other journalist.
Yeah.
So, I mean, one thing that's very clear to me with some of the surveillance programs that have been revealed is that when everyone is a target, everyone has to sort of work together to create solutions. And as an example, I think Zeit Online has done a very good job with their leaking platform. I think other news agencies like the Wall Street Journal, they didn't do as well. Al Jazeera didn't do as well with their initial launch. Zeit did a very good job because they actually brought in some people from the Chaos Computer Club, very reputable computer security people, and they asked them to help build it. I think learning from some of the successes of different news organizations is very powerful. And it doesn't just have to be about individual communications, but actually about workflows. So if you want to send a document to people at Zeit Online, I think you have a much better chance of doing it securely than you would if you wanted to share it with another organization that doesn't have something like this.
Or you could share documents with Der Spiegel if you put it in an envelope and hand it over to us very securely. No worries whatsoever. Because on the internet, we see if people send files over the internet, there has to be so many precautions taken, so many things taken into consideration. You have, there's our first guest. I think for sources to actually tell them, please send us a digital file, I don't know. Then there's Heartbleed and other critical bugs in infrastructure. I don't know. Can I tell my sources, oh, well, you go to the secret site and put a file on there? I would much rather say, use the post system, send a letter.
Yeah, so that works well until you understand that the postal system, for example, in the United States, has the same surveillance, where when you take a letter and you put it in a mailbox and it goes to, let's say, the New York Times, the outside of the letter is actually, I believe, photographed.
Yeah, it's the same in Germany too.
And stored.
The post is taking pictures of the addresses.
Yeah.
But they tell that they designed the system not to store these kind of data. A judge might come in and tell them, well, you know.
Well, in the US, they don't make that claim. They don't say that it's for anything else. I mean, when, for example, postal surveillance is revealed, part of what we see is an internal consistency between the postal system, the telephone system, and the internet. And that's actually very scary. But so what I think is useful for journalists to do is to explore these issues. Because actually, well, I think Zeit's online system was designed by really, really, really good people. That doesn't change the fact that at all times, we have to have a discussion about threat modeling, about safety planning, about understanding the consequences, about actually being able to do this not just in a digital way, but also in an analog way, but then understanding the trade-offs. So yeah, perhaps the right answer is that you walk into Spiegel headquarters, but we need to have, for example, a really nice online guide or a printed guide that explains the different ways and the different risks and the different threats. And I think from a national security perspective, WikiLeaks has done a very good job of sort of, setting the stage. And I think other organizations should learn from the successes and the mistakes of WikiLeaks in online whistleblowing platforms. But I think also, other groups have set the stage for the offline version of that. And the key is that journalists that are involved in that go and meet a source, they need to understand the risk they present to their source, not when they're overtly challenged in court. Because some journalists are very clear. They actually very much refuse to talk. They won't disclose information about sources. And they would go to jail for their sources. If you talk with Laura Poitras or Glenn Greenwald or Barton Gellman, these are, or Reißmann actually, these are people who are they're willing to put themselves on the line to continue to publish and to work. But they also have a survival advantage over many other journalists, which is that they actually understand the online and the offline threats that exist and the way that they merge together. And I think they understand that if they carry a cell phone all the time, that cell phone is a transitive risk. And so I think that discussion needs to be explored by journalists, where they explain it not just to the general public, but actually to other journalists. And Julian, from WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, has tried to do this for a long time. He was very adversarial about it. He was very critiquing of the journalistic environment. It probably is reflected in the fact that he worked with The Guardian, but I think it's not completely clear, but he was a little adversarial before that as well. And I think we need a friendlier tone about that, where we need to actually have an exploratory process about that and how it affects journalists, because how journalists are affected is how we see that free press is affected, which affects the societies in which we live. And I mean, it's a very simplistic analysis, but there's clearly a link between these things, and we should consider how we can effectively communicate that. And that's a lot more than just using PGP or encryption tools. It's about contextualizing the whole situation.
Do you think there might be a line that could be crossed, that when journalists call for legislative action, is that a thing a journalist could do?
Well, I mean, I don't think so. When you have journalists like Bill Keller advocating for the Iraq War, for example, what have you done? I mean, to me, it's a very strange thing. It's again this Glenn Greenwald activism thing. In this case, activism is used as a pejorative statement, where the idea is that to be engaged in your democracy is considered somehow an exceptional thing. And a journalist who dares to display openly their political alignments, that somehow that's a bad thing. I'm actually really glad that Bill Keller argues the things he does in the open when he does, because it shows him to be the asshole that he is, which is really critical, a very important thing. And the same is true with Julian Assange. He can be a very, very difficult guy, and I'm so glad he does it openly, because the point of the press is to have these discussions, to have these debates, and to have them openly and with each other. And that's very, very powerful to do that. And I think it's great that Glenn also lays out what he thinks after analyzing documents for a year, what he thinks we should do about it. Because he is an important luminary in this space, and he has seen many documents, many analyses, talked with many sources. And so what he thinks actually impacts how I think, and his analysis impacts how I think about it. So when he debates Michael Hayden and Dershowitz and mops the floor with them, just completely eviscerates their arguments, I think that's great, because what he's doing is he's calling, again, a check to their power. And to suggest, for example, that a journalist who merely reports on the facts and does not say anything else about it is somehow neutral is, I think, a ridiculous statement, because in fact, often such statements, such pieces are an endorsement of the status quo. If you don't confront a person in a position of power who has lied, and you report only a few facts, but you omit many others, that is too a political thing. And it's much better, I think, to just have that out in the open than to pretend it doesn't exist at all. So, someone in the audience probably has a question. I don't think we can talk forever, although we could try. Surely there's someone that disagrees with all of the nonsense that I'm saying. No?
There's not.
Well, we can go on, I suppose.
Yeah, okay, so now that you mentioned WikiLeaks, and that you've been involved with WikiLeaks in the past years, what was the difference between WikiLeaks and the media in the US and in Germany?
Well, one difference is that in Germany, WikiLeaks is seen as a partner, as a journalistic partner. And in the United States, because it was so effective at releasing information and framing that information in a powerful way, for example, calling collateral murder, not collateral damage. For example, when journalists talk about drone strikes and they don't call it a tactical attack, or they don't call it a drone strike, but they call it what it is, which is an assassination. That's a very powerful thing. And in the case of WikiLeaks, when you call a spade, as you see this, but as many other people see it, and as technically the words are defined, boy, did the US government get really mad about that. And it was very, very, very clear that effective journalism that challenged the status quo was to be treated as terrorism. And so in the case of the WikiLeaks grand jury that has been ongoing now for many years, actually, I've actually been told by people inside the FBI and by people investigating the grand jury and the investigation that they consider potentially that it is a Category 2 terrorism investigation, which means that as part of the normal process for investigating subjects of that, which includes me, they have the ability to do things like surreptitious entry. That means they can break into your house without ever giving you a search warrant and plant listening devices and take things and take photographs and use that as evidence, as well as to later come back with a search warrant based on the things that they saw, a so-called sneak and peek. As far as I understand, if that happened to someone working with Der Spiegel here in Germany, it would bring down the government. And it did in the Spiegel affair. So it strikes me as a very stark difference that WikiLeaks people are treated as terrorists. And I was actually told by someone that that did happen to my house. And I have some evidence of that, but it's very difficult to prove surreptitious entry because, of course, if someone breaks in but doesn't steal anything, my house felt different one day, to say the least. But that has a big difference here in Germany. It's not a legitimate on-the-books thing to treat people that are working with journalistic organizations like that. Now, I think it does happen to some people, and I did, in fact, confront an interior minister on the Maybrit Illner show about this, where I said, do you break into people's houses? Do you break into their computers? And he said, no, we don't do that. Of course we do that, which is a strange answer. But that for terrorism-related investigations, one can sort of see how that comes about. But for journalism, to brand it as terrorism is an expansion of power. And I just haven't seen that kind of thing happening here as I've seen it in the US. And I mean, as a result, I live here now, and I don't even travel to the United States anymore because just years of harassment is enough. It's exhausting, and it's pointless. And I can actually work here on the topics I'm interested in without having an FBI agent come to my house and bother me, or to a panel. Like, for example, in the United States, I gave a speech about Chinese internet surveillance, and 2 FBI agents approached me after the talk. Or for years after this, when I would fly into the United States, they would detain me, and they let me know that it was specifically for my political beliefs about the Iraq War, and that it would never stop, quote. So there's a difference. When I come to Germany and they run my passport, the little computer file, I've asked to see it, and they've shown it to me, and there's nothing. That doesn't mean that nothing is happening, but there's nothing there. Whereas once I was detained in an airport cell in Toronto by the US government, and they put me in a room that had a mirror, and they sat me in an interrogation cell, and they were like, we want to talk to you about where you've been, what you've been doing. I think I'd been in Germany, actually, and dangerous country. And I was on my way back, and I said, well, can I just see my file? Because there must be some mistake. And the guy says to me, and it's like the funniest thing that any authoritarian person has ever said to me. He's like, well, you can't see that because you might know that someone was after you. And I said, I'm sitting in an interrogation cell. You got me. There's no doubt about it. But by the way, this double-sided mirror, I can see my file through this window. And I look through the window, and you can see it. And there's a picture of me, has a Facebook link, a Twitter link, and a bunch of other information, and then some stuff and some red lines, blink, warning kind of thing. It's like, well, but I can't quite read it. So could you just show it to me? Maybe we could fix this stuff, because I think that this is a mistake. And he's like, no, that's not possible. You can't see it. I'm like, no, I can see it through the mirror. It's right there. No, you can't see it. Okay, well, I've got nothing else to say. I'd like to go to my flight. That just doesn't happen to me here in Germany. And the absurdity of it as well is missing, which is a nice change. But it's not like that for everybody. So, I guess I'm lucky in this sense here. But it's certainly a stark contrast from being a journalist working in the United States.
Do you think there's a difference between how WikiLeaks and WikiLeaks activists and journalists were treated back then and, for example, Glenn Greenwald is treated right now? Because he traveled to the US recently and it went smoothly, as far as I know.
Yeah, so I mean, I took him and Laura to the airport here in Berlin, and then they flew to New York City. And you know, there's a lot of stress about that flight. There was a lot of fear, and I think it's justified. The Obama administration has cracked down on more whistleblowers than all of the previous presidencies combined. That's a lot. And there's a lot of fear. And the Obama administration, again, wants James Reißmann to give up sources. They do not respect the freedom of the press. Barrett Brown, forced basically to take a plea deal and has been jailed, again, for linking to information that other people have produced by trying to raise awareness about this. So in the case of Glenn, you know, when he flew back, I mean, I don't speak for him, but I know that there was a lot of tension about that and a lot of concern. And we actually went through some complicated procedures to make sure that if they were arrested, there were people to call, there were things to be done. And that was a very serious concern. It is not unlike preparations for journalists that travel to Russia that I've worked with, or that travel to other places. When I was in Burma, for example, we had some precautions that we took before going in there, and it is the same. If you are trying to serve as an effective check to very powerful people in the United States, you have to have a safety plan, and you need to have lawyers who are going to be there to back you up. You need to know that it's possible that when you fly there, all of your electronic equipment will be taken from you. You need to know that maybe they'll break into it when you're not there. That's, I mean, it's a sad reality. And I think that Glenn is aware of the fact that he is a target. And during his debate with Hayden and Dershowitz, you know, he was debating with people who called for him to be put in prison. I mean, it doesn't really get more directly hostile unless you are a Russian journalist who's shot in the face. I mean, it's like next step up. And I'm glad it's not there. There are always worse places to be a journalist. But we shouldn't fool ourselves. I mean, I don't fear for my life walking down the street in Germany. He doesn't in Brazil either. But there is a real existential threat to working on NSA-related issues or CIA-related issues where journalists that work on that really do have a serious concern, and there's a morbidity about it. With Julian, for example, whenever we say goodbye after meeting, you know, we always say, you know, remember, if anything happens, no matter what, it was murder. That's a terrible attitude, but it's actually reflective of a sort of long-standing fear that we all have, which is we're really involved in things where the people that are doing this are actually killing people. Like if you expose a drone killing, or if you expose, like it's the collateral murder video, these are people who shot children in a war zone and then blamed them for bringing children to a war zone. Never mind that we brought the war zone to the children, but I mean, that creates a tension, and that tension is not lost with Glenn or with Laura or with Julian or with myself. And it would be great, though, if we could change that, and we should. We shouldn't have that kind of environment. One major difference I see working with Spiegel is that when the editorial process, let's say we have some documents, and they're sensitive documents, every single document, we go through it and ask if it's in the public interest as the first concern. And in the United States, working with some journalists, the first concern is, what will the government do to us if we publish it? And the second concern is, what good will it serve us? And the third concern is the public interested? And that's I mean, that's a stark difference which reflects a general feeling of insecurity, actually.
So what do we make of that when the parliament asked our government to, well, what would happen if we invite Snowden to testify in parliament? And then the government says, oh, well, yeah, we can't do that. And by the way, here's a letter from a US law firm. And it basically says any politician who will even dare to ask Snowden any question could be held liable in the US. Is it a threat?
I mean, you know, there's a saying in the United States about lawyers, it's probably the same here in Germany, which is that a bad lawyer tells you about what you can't do and why you shouldn't do it. And a good lawyer tells you how to do it and what the risks are. So the German government found a law firm that was awful, and they got an awful answer, which was exactly in service of what they wanted, which in an ironic way is almost indistinguishable from a good law firm giving them advice to do a terrible thing, which is to leave Edward Snowden hanging. But I'm not shocked by that. I mean, Merkel didn't care about every German being spied on. She got upset when she found out that included her. Glad to know. And that's why we revealed that it was important for people to understand it. But then it shows, I mean, she is not so concerned with actually resolving the systemic failures here. And so she asked for a no-spy agreement. And of course, that's not going to happen, because it turns out that when you ask the superpower, please be merciful, they say, well, maybe not. And that's what happens when you ask, right? I mean, it's like a bunch of wolves deciding how to eat the sheep for dinner. And so it's a really sad thing, but it is a predictable outcome that they would be cowardly about inviting a witness to serious crimes that happen on German soil and around the world to people, including Germans, and that is not. I mean, that's not to be. I wouldn't expect them to be brave about that. In fact, they've shown themselves consistently to cower and to wish to join. So they wanted to join the Five Eyes. I mean, what does that tell you about the quality of their character? They do not concern themselves with the morality of it. They don't concern themselves with the risks and the economic considerations. They merely wish to be a part of that power structure.
Yeah, it's a very realistic, pragmatic approach to that, because they can't change that system, so better join them.
Well, right. I mean, that's an interesting Faustian pact, right? And we all know the story of Faust and how well that works out. So I'm not sure that that's actually the lesson to take from that story. And I think the thing is that in the end, the parliamentary investigation that's happening here will probably show a lot more complicity than the German government is comfortable with. I mean, it's quite clear to me that the BND, the Bundesnachrichtendienst and the Verfassungsschutz, that they have cooperated with the CIA and the NSA in many things, including extrajudicial assassinations through their drone program. I look forward to the names of every single agent responsible in the chain of command who has abdicated their duty to humanity coming out. There should be justice for these things. And the fact of the matter is that when people don't want someone to come, I mean, Edward Snowden is not like a Che Guevara, right? I mean, he's like a really honest man of integrity. And when they say they don't want to hear evidence about crimes that have been committed, that tells you something about these people. And I think that we should confront them about that. And in particular, I think in the future, we'll learn more about that. I mean, Germans, especially because Germans travel a lot, there's a really funny thing, which is that in a lot of the places that have the most surveillance, there are Germans who are victims. It includes Germany, but think of all the places Germans vacation. The level of surveillance that Germans are under there is actually extremely high, and the German government does nothing about that. And that also is very strange to me. And it's not, for me, it's not a political thing, a left or right thing. It's about power. And Germany doesn't want to challenge the power, which is immoral, that my country is pushing on the rest of the world. And I wish that Germany, especially Merkel, would recognize that if she does that, it can help all of us. And I wish she would stand with the American people, for example, instead of sucking up to the American government, which to me is really sad, especially when we revealed that she was a target of that surveillance by name for many, many, many years. But the investigation will continue, and a lot more of these things will come out and will be very, very embarrassing to the German government over time. And maybe they'll get on the side of humanity at some point and do something right about Edward Snowden, whether it's giving him asylum or merely asking him questions and saying, yeah, I dare you to prosecute our parliamentarians for investigating a crime on German soil. I mean, that would be the brave thing to do, and I hope they'll do it.
That's for a pretty depressing start on the day. Thank you all for coming. I think there's something more coming up right here. Thanks for listening. And you've seen we could go on forever. We see each other next year, talk about more NSA stuff.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Thank you.